Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Kevin. I'm joined by Claire and Rachel here. And so we'll be presenting, like Marta said, 1951 to 1969. And this is just our overview of all of our milestones. We'll just quickly go through this so that we've got lots to get through.
Okay, so in 1952, the planning department was established, and it adopted certain aspects from the spent sales plan report. Its purpose was to provide the City Council with continuous planning advice and was to be more associated with civic administration than previously. It also became an independent department. And then in 1968, the creation of the new Development Permit Board and Advisory Panel gave the department more responsibility.
So in 1953, we have the adoption of the Vancouver Charter, and this was a provincial statute that outlined the rules that govern how the city operates, how budgets are set, and what bylaws the City Council can pass. And its purpose was really to recognize the uniqueness of Vancouver and to tailor legislation to a large urban center. And so the immediate impact was that it served to supersede the Vancouver Incorporation Act, and it granted the City of Vancouver greater powers than other municipalities in BC who operated under the Local Government Act. And some of these powers, though, they weren't actually felt until the 1970s and 1980s, and this is when we really begin to see the city start experimenting with its planning policies. And so, for example, it granted the city more flexibility in permissions associated with development cost levies and CACs. And so if the city wanted to change its legislation or legislative authority, it had two options. It could enact that change anyways, and if it was successful, it would be amended into the Vancouver Charter, or the province could just let the change go, knowing full well that it would only be contained within Vancouver, and if the change was successful, they could also amend that into the Local Government Act. In 1954, with the opening of Little Mountain Housing Project, and so this was Vancouver's first public housing project, and it provided subsidized rental housing for low and moderate income families and seniors. And it was the result of two different developments. In 1944, the Curtis Report, which called for a national housing program, national public housing program, and in 1949, a Section 35 amendment to the National Housing Act, which set out the federal provincial funding for these public housing projects. And in Vancouver, there was a long debate over how this project would operate in Vancouver. And it really wasn't about the details of how it was designed or the funding. It was really a discussion of whether Vancouver wanted public housing at all. So several of the aldermen in Vancouver argued in a letter to the mayor that this would set a precedent for thousands more of these public housing projects. But finally, it was once again approved in 1953, and by 1954, some of the first families moved in. And so some of the impact, it was really the outcome of a decade-long struggle of political activism from several different groups. And this was a sort of a galvanized support for the idea of public housing, and it really set out how the federal provincial funding for these projects would operate here in Vancouver. And it's also actually of national significance as well, because it was only the second housing project built under this Section 35 amendment in 1949. And actually the first one was built in Newfoundland, and it actually didn't fulfill some of the goals set out in this Section 35 amendment. So it can be argued that it was the very first in Canada to fulfill these goals. Our next milestone is a collection of many different milestones that we've termed the provincial expansion of highway access into Vancouver. So at this time, in the 50s and 60s, we see a dramatic increase of provincial spending on intercity transportation rather than intra-city transportation. And so the first one that we have here is the Oak Street Bridge. It opened in 1957. And it actually opened with tolls, a 25-cent toll to begin with. And a lot of the Richmond residents felt that they were unfairly subsidizing this bridge because it helped serve, along with the new Morey Channel Bridge, the federally owned Vancouver International Airport. And so several letters or lots of correspondence between Richmond and the federal government over the funding for this. The federal government only ever provided $400,000, and that actually went into the Morey Channel Bridge, not the Oak Street Bridge. But in 1963, the tolls were actually removed. as opposed to the 12 years that they had first proposed. Some of the impact, well, it helped replace traffic on the Marpole Bridge as well as the Fraser Street Swingspan Bridge, and it really created a corridor for Richmond residents going into Vancouver. And sort of the lasting impact then, once we have Highway 17, Highway 99, and the Dees Island Tunnel, it provided a link both to the border with the US and also the provincially owned ferry terminal at Tsawwassen. And it also allowed many more people to live in Richmond as well. So we see a dramatic increase of about 17,000 Richmond residents in just 5 short years. And it also, we see the beginning of the demise of Hudson Street in Marpole. So in 1950, that contained about 50 stores. And by 1985, a dramatic decrease to around 9. Obviously, this was compounded, of course, as well by the Arthur Lane Bridge in 1976. But these kind of all combined to the demise of Hudson Street and Marpole. The next one we have is the Dees Island Tunnel in 1959. It was opened by Queen Elizabeth II, and as early as 1888, there were petitions calling for a crossing from Ladner over to Lulu Island. But those petitions only resulted in a small ferry service pictured here. And following this, many different reports were actually submitted calling for a massive bridge crossing over from Ladner to Lulu Island. But it wasn't until 1946 that machine shop operator George Massey advocated for a tunnel crossing. And the real turning point, though, was 1952 when Phil Ghilardi became Minister of Public Works. Shortly thereafter, the BC Toll, Highway and Bridges Authority came into power with a mandate to increase funding on bridges and highway infrastructure. And so by 1956, Ghilardi announced plans for this. Its immediate impact was that it dramatically increased the available crossing from communities south of the Fraser into Vancouver. So 7,000 cars per hour on the new tunnel, whereas these old ferries carried 150 cars per hour. And sort of like the Oak Street Bridge, it opened up development in Richmond and then also in these Fraser Valley communities. And again, once Highway 17 and Highway 99 was all complete, connected to the US border and to the provincially owned ferry terminal at Tsawwassen. And actually, just before we move on, just the quote at the top is, "The Dees Island Tunnel, a triumph today for British Columbia's tomorrow," taken from it was a 30-minute documentary on the construction of the Dees Island Tunnel. And so we moved from something like this, proclaiming the modernity of the Dees Island Tunnel, to planning our future again.
So in 1960, the second Narrows Bridge opened. It replaced the previous bridge. It also added more lanes, so it's now a 6-lane bridge, enhancing the commuter corridor from North Vancouver to downtown. And it was also part of the Trans-Canada Highway. As shown on the graph over there, it shows, it's kind of small, but it shows the daily crossings increase from 1965 to 1999, so it definitely shows that it's one more. And then in 1964, the Portman Bridge was opened. It created a corridor again to the Fraser Valley, and at the time it cost $25 million. It originally was a toll-free bridge, so it aided in the increase in development in the Guildford and Fleetwood areas of Missouri. And then in 2012, the new Portman Bridge was built. It was 10 lanes, but this time it didn't have a toll, which was a change. So it definitely shows the increase in the population of the area with the new bridge being built.
And so paralleling this provincial expansion of highway access into Vancouver, at the same time in 1958 we have the end of rail transit service. And so this was really the end, or it ended 67 years of passenger rail service in Vancouver. And contrary to sort of these ideas of a GM Firestone tire conspiracy, this was a BC Electric mandated movement known as Rails to Rubber, where they're shifting everything, all their streetcars and interurbans over to buses. And so I provided the timeline there of all the different interurban lines closing. Of course, during this time you see all the different streetcar lines closing as well. But what this did is really signal the end of rail transit in Vancouver. And sort of ushered in this era dominated by automobile and auto-oriented infrastructure. Of course, this is paralleled by all this spending in highways, bridges, tunnels. We see a dramatic decrease in passenger counts when they shift over to buses. In 1948, BC Electric carried 149 million passengers across its streetcars and interurban lines. By 1958, that was just 101 million. This is when most of these interurbans had closed down. And in 1962, when the entire system relied on buses, those passenger counts were just 80.8 million. So the transportation system that had determined much of Vancouver's development now ceased to exist.
So also in 1958 was the Vancouver Redevelopment Study that was approved by City Council. And it was basically a replicate of a study done by UBC in 1949. And the quote at the top kind of sums it up pretty well. Blight is contagious. When it is found only in a few isolated structures, it can be cured quickly and easily. When it infects a whole district, it begins to threaten the economic basis of the entire city. And only the most drastic and expensive remedies will suffice. So it was a 5 and 20-year plan for blighted areas in Vancouver, and it describes phases of redevelopment for various neighborhoods, starting with the most blighted ones, which they deemed as Strathcona, Kitsilano, and False Creek. So between 1961 and 1967, the city demolished 37 acres of residential land, displacing over 3,300 people. So the first project that did go through was Strathcona Project 1, which was approved in 1960. It involved the construction of McLean Park and Skeena Terrace public housing. It displaced 1,600 people, majority of whom were Chinese, and the letters of expropriation were only printed in English, not in Chinese dialects, which became a problem for properly informing the residents of what was happening in the area at the time. And Strathcona Project 2 was the only other urban renewal project that went through from this study. And it was approved in 1963, and it involved Bring Your Public Housing Project, private row house development for senior citizens, and an extension to the Lord Strathcona School. It displaced about 1,700 people, again, majority Chinese. Before the project was approved, the Chinatown Property Owners Association was formed with approximately 300 members who were against urban renewal plans in Strathcona. And Mr. Foon Sien was appointed by the City Council to liaise with these residents. And despite his urgent calls to stop these urban renewal projects, the project obviously went through anyways. And out of protest, he resigned, pointing out to Council that the intention to disperse the Chinese district had much in common with the forced evacuation of Vancouver's Little Tokyo during the Second World War.
In 1966, the official regional plan was adopted. The Lower Mainland Regional Board published two things beforehand: the 1952 the Lower Mainland Looks Ahead and the 1963 Chance and Challenge Report. The Lieutenant Governor officially adopted the regional plan on August 29, 1966. The first amendments to the plan involved the Regional Parks Plan and the Regional Waterfront Plan study. When the Greater Vancouver Regional District took over responsibilities for regional planning, all previous made legislative actions were reviewed, which included this regional plan. And in 1967, the Greater Vancouver Regional District was created. There's a series of events that led to this. First off was the Regional District of Fraser-Bourne was incorporated in 1967. And then less than a month later, it changed its name to the Greater Vancouver Regional District. In 1968, a motion was passed for it to take over regional planning from the Lower Mainland Regional Planning Board. However, in January 1969, it was decided not to be ready yet, and then finally in April 1969, the Greater Vancouver Regional District took over responsibilities for regional planning. And then one of the first studies it undertook was about rapid transit to serve the whole regional area eventually, and it integrated with the Greater Vancouver Sewage and Drainage District and the Greater Vancouver Water District in 1970. And then lasting impacts, it changed its name to Metro Vancouver in 2007 and adopted an air quality management plan in 2009.
So in 1968, we have City Council scraps plans for the Chinatown part of the freeway. In 1967, city planners submitted a report or proposed report for an elevated 8-lane freeway that would cut right through Chinatown. And this was part of a larger freeway network that would link up to a waterfront development known as Project 200 and a third crossing of Burrard Inlet. Soon after they proposed this in 1967, the opposition began to mount against the project. So we have letters from the Chinese Benevolent Association to the mayor expressing their opposition, and then in 1968 we have a pro-freeway Rathy council being replaced by an anti-freeway council. But the scrapping of the plans was, while the opposition to the proposal, or to the highway proposal, certainly played a massive part in creating the climate of the time, it was really down to a federal-provincial struggle over who would actually pay for the freeway. And so the immediate impact, of course, it saved Chinatown and Strathcona neighborhoods, and it also ended any support for freeways into the downtown. And it really demonstrated that a pro-growth coalition could be challenged and stopped. And at this time as well, then, we really start to see City of Vancouver move away from what the provincial government was initiating with their expansion of bridges and highways, and the City of Vancouver is shifting its focus from automobile-oriented infrastructure to transit, cycling, and walking. And lastly, Chinatown is becomes sort of this landmark that needs to be preserved and celebrated. It's one of the arguments that the Benevolent Association argued for in their letter to the mayor, that Chinatown is a huge draw, not only for tourists, but also for many people in the community.
So our final milestone is 1969, the termination of post-war concept of urban renewal in Vancouver and Canada. So the year before this, in 1968, renewal plans were still very much underway in Vancouver. And this milestone particularly focuses on the ones of Strathcona and Kitsilano. So the one on the left is for Strathcona Urban Renewal Project 3, and the one on the right is pretty faint, but it's of Kitsilano. And so the Kitsilano project involved approximately 90 acres of land for the creation of an Arbutus-Burrard connector street and a large park space. So on November 7th, 1968, Paul Hellyer was the federal housing minister, and his assistant Lloyd Axworthy listened to community activist Shirley Chan discuss the issues facing Chinese families in Strathcona. And the next day, Chan and Darlene Mazzari, the social planner for the City of Vancouver, gave them a tour of Chinatown and Strathcona to show the reality of the situation. And following that tour, Mazzari and Shirley Chan assisted Hellyer in drafting a letter which was sent to Ottawa that officially froze urban renewal funding across the nation. So this was a big triumph for the Strathcona Property Owners and Tenants Association, as well as the Kitsilano Area Council, because for Strathcona, 3,000 people would have been displaced over about 900 acres of land in Vancouver, and in Kitsilano it would have displaced dozens of residents over approximately 90 acres. So this decision to freeze federal funding for urban renewal was then channeled into rehabilitation projects in Strathcona. So that project ended in 1975, and it created new parks, sidewalks, and a community center in Strathcona, and granted up to $3,000 for rehabilitation projects on the homes. And because of years of struggle to save the neighborhood, Strathcona is now a neighborhood with a strong sense of identity and pride not found in many of Vancouver's neighborhoods. And while the case of Kitsilano is not as extreme as Strathcona is, it's still an important case to look at. For example, if the park had actually gone through, you can kind of see at the top of that box there, it would have cut through 4th Avenue as we know it today, so it would have just been interesting to see if the hub of 4th Avenue that we know it today, if it would have existed if this park had gone through. And that's all on Milestones.
Thank you.